head of the organization here for the last 12 years. I'm first and foremost a Korea specialist. You note I use the word specialist rather than expert because I focus mostly on North Korea. And the chairman of my board of directors is Walter Mondale. Who knows who Walter Mondale is? Oh, good. I mean, this is actually a great humbling thing. Walter Mondale was Jimmy Carter's vice president. So for my generation, everybody knows who Walter Mondale was. He ran against Reagan in '84. But it's just always a reality check for me to find out how quickly the institutional knowledge fades as we go forward. But Walter Mondale, in addition to being vice president and presidential candidate, he was also our ambassador to Japan in the Clinton administration. And while he was ambassador to Japan, he would say repeatedly, if anybody tells you he's an expert on North Korea, watch out. In other words, this is a country that's so opaque, we know so very little about it, so much information is influenced by intelligence services on one side or the other that is useful to have a big caveat on how much you understand. I've been asked to talk today, if I understand correctly, kind of wither U.S.-North Korea relations. So I will talk about the U.S.-North Korea relationship and some of the issues that face it. There's obviously a lot on the table. Nuclear weapons, human rights, shelling South Korean villages, sinking of submarines, North Korean involvement in counterfeiting and drug smuggling, other illicit activities, succession in North Korea, food situation. So I can't cover all of that in an hour, let alone 20 minutes. So what I would propose to do is give you kind of an overview for maybe about 20 minutes, and then just open it up to any questions that you might be interested in, China's role, South Korea's role, etc. And I wanted to start by kind of putting U.S.-North Korea relations in context. To begin with, obviously, understanding North Korea may seem like a strange thing to do given its relative prominence in the world, right? It's not a major economy, right? It's a tiny little country, population of about 20 million people in terms of size, in terms of population, definitely in terms of the economy. So why do we pay attention to North Korea? Why do we care? Why would you sit here and have a lesson? And really, it's because of North Korea's capacity to threaten the region and the world. And my apologies to those of you who may be from Bangladesh, because I actually like Bangladesh, right? But I often say that if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, North Korea would be Bangladesh. Because Bangladesh, by every measure, is more important than North Korea. It has more people, larger population, a bigger economy. And yet, when is the last time you saw Bangladesh on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post? Right? You don't. And the reality is it's because we get focused on the threats that come to us, and that makes news, right? And North Korea certainly has provided a lot of news, for the last 50 years, but particularly for the last 20. So to give you the 30-second, kind of historical perspective, you all know about the Japanese occupation of Korea during World War II and much prior to that. You know about the division of Korea, which was followed by the Korean War, and the truce that kind of ended the hostilities in the Korean War in 1953. From that point on, for about 40 years, almost nothing changed. U.S.-Korean relations were defined first and foremost by deterrence. Any dealings we had with North Korea was through the Military Armistice Commission. There were incidences. North Korea took the USS Pueblo, a spy ship, and held their crew captive in 1968, in 1972, or maybe 76, I can't remember. There was an axe murder incident where some Americans were out there in the DMZ area and were cutting down a tree, and a North Korean squad came and chopped them up with axes. It was a big issue. This in the 70s. There were tunnels under the DMZ. There were issues. But one way or the other, we didn't deal with North Korea. We never signed a peace treaty with them. We never normalized relations with North Korea. We don't have an embassy there. We don't have diplomats there. We are still technically at war with North Korea in that regard, right? We just have a truce, and no peace treaty in that regard. And that was kind of fine. We did this kind of through the UN. The head of the U.S. forces in Korea was also at the same time head of the United Nations Command. We wore two different hats. And that defined our relationship. And it didn't really begin to shift until the end of the Cold War. So at the very end of the Reagan and then the Bush administrations, the first Papa Bush administration, there was a focus on kind of what they called the modest initiative, early engagement with North Korea. Unfortunately, that also coincided with growing concerns about a North Korean nuclear program. Now, North Korea, as you might understand, like many other despots and rogues around the world, have a fascination with the nuclear program, right? Because if you're North Korea, think about it, right? You've been occupied by Japan for, the better part of 40 years, and you've been fighting, if you're Kim Il-sung, against the Japanese occupiers. And the only way you see independence come is at the hands of nuclear bombs, right? And so from day one, from the founding of North Korea, there's been this mentality of, I got to get me one of those, right? That notion that they want nuclear weapons. And so early on, in the 50s and the 60s, there were lots of evidence of North Koreans trying to get the Chinese and the Russians to provide them with nuclear weapons. And then the Russians and the Chinese, or the Soviets and the Chinese at that time, refused. In fact, you may be familiar with the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? This is a global, it's essentially unfair treaty, but it's an unfair treaty that everybody agrees is a good thing, right? Because basically, those countries that have nuclear weapons agreed that they wouldn't use them on countries that don't. And they also agreed that eventually they'd get rid of them. That part we haven't held upon our bargain. But more importantly, the 180 some odd other countries who didn't have nuclear weapons agreed that the world would be a safer place if they all agreed not to get nuclear weapons, and those who had them would not proliferate them, right? And the agreement hasn't been perfect. There have been problems in places like Israel, problems, of course, in Pakistan and in India, in terms of countries who did not sign on to the NPT. But for better or for worse, this has maintained relative stability. And the implementing agreement of the NPT is what's called the IAEA Nuclear Safeguards Agreement, the International Atomic Energy Agency. So in 1985, the Soviets and the Chinese basically twisted the North Koreans' arms and said, look, we're happy to let you have a small light water nuclear reactor, that's going to help you, not light water, a small graphite nuclear research reactor, but you have to sign on to the NPT. You have to agree with the 180 other countries that you won't become a nuclear power. And so North Korea reluctantly did this in '85, but it took them 7 years before they signed on to a nuclear safeguards agreement in 1992. And that took place at exactly the same time that we were having the first Gulf War with Iraq, when the IAEA inspectors had found that the Iraqi program at that time was far more developed. So when they went to North Korea, they had a newfound zeal, a lot of new technology, and they immediately found out that the North Koreans were cheating on their program. And that started what we call the first nuclear crisis in North Korea. This was in the early days of the Clinton administration, in 1993 and 1994. And so in a nutshell, the U.S. and the IAEA said to North Korea, look, the data doesn't add up. You haven't accounted for all your plutonium. Yeah. Where is it? The North Korean says, whoa, we didn't bargain on this. You were supposed to be able to find that out. The IAEA demanded special inspections. North Korea said, no way. We said, we're going to take you to the UN Security Council. North Korea said, you take us to the Security Council, we'll consider that an act of war. They said, we'll turn Seoul into a sea of fire. And it really became a very tense situation in 1994. So we're talking about April of 1994. North Korea removed the spent fuel rods from the reactors without inspectors present. President Clinton at the time was thinking about military strikes against North Korea. And we really came close to conflict, right? It was avoided because former President Jimmy Carter said, well, I got this. And he came in, even though he wasn't invited, he negotiated with Kim Il-sung and said, look, if you just freeze your program, you don't have to give it up. You don't have to go back to your IAEA safeguards agreement or NPT agreement, just freeze it. And then we'll provide you energy assistance and heavy fuel oil, and we'll even build you some proliferation-resistant light water nuclear reactors. That's the core of the deal. Kim Il-sung says, oh, sounds like a good deal. It became what was called the 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework. And this was on October 21st of 1994. And for 10 years, this agreement became the foundation for U.S. and North Korea relations. It was the North Koreans presumed that based upon this, we would move forward to normalization. We would have cross-recognition where the Russians and the Chinese would recognize South Korea, which they had done earlier in '92, right? Where then the U.S. and Japan would recognize North Korea and things would move forward, right? Well, in the end, it became very, very complex, right? The U.S. in 1994, after signing this agreement in October, 3 weeks later, the Republicans took control of Congress, right? And weren't at all happy about the notion of Clinton dealing with, these baddies North Koreans, undermined the deal from the very beginning. The U.S. really didn't keep up their side of the bargain in terms of normalization. The North Koreans didn't keep up their side of the bargain in terms of shutting down the nuclear program and other research efforts. But for the better or for worse, for 10 years, this became the foundation of our relationship. You may not know Walter Mondale, but hopefully you've still seen the Roadrunner cartoons, the Coyote and Roadrunner. You know how the coyote always runs off the cliff and he stands there for 3 or 4 seconds before he falls down, right? Well, for the better or for worse, South Korea's approach to North Korea was called the Sunshine Policy, and it lasted for about 10 years. That policy was based on, the engagement of North Korea on the nuclear issue. In other words, unless you have a security foundation, the 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework, you really can't have economic trade and assistance and investment and tourism, all the other things that come with it, right? You're still very much at war. The problem was that under South Korea, long after that foundation had eroded, they were still standing there thinking it was going on. It took kind of a decade before it's fallen. And so what you've seen recently in Seoul is essentially the curve falling down, go poof at the bottom there in terms of that relationship. But what really happened was that the North Koreans implemented it, but slowly. There were a lot of problems. There was a submarine incident in the south. A North Korean submarine came ashore with special agents in a big fight. There was a case where the international community discovered an underground facility that we suspected North Koreans were using to develop other types of nuclear weapons. We negotiated for years to get access to it. There was a 1998 missile test that North Korea tested over Japan that alarmed the Japanese and fundamentally changed that dynamic. So I'm not saying that decade was a peaceful time, but for better or for worse, that Geneva Agreed framework became the foundation upon which the Sunshine Policy was based, upon which U.S.-North Korea relations were based. While President Bush was elected in 2000, deeply skeptical of the Agreed framework, deeply skeptical of the North Koreans, didn't trust them as far as he could throw them. Bush famously said in his book with Bob Woodward, says, "I loathe Kim Jong-il," right? He called him a pygmy, which is not exactly normal diplomatic speak. You don't call other leaders pygmies. In fact, as an inside joke, I'll tell you, I took a very senior Bush administration official to Seoul. And this was during a very progressive government in Seoul in the early 2000s. And the Koreans, high-level officials, were asking this Bush administration official, they're saying, "Do you think that President Bush will apologize for calling Kim Jong-il a pygmy?" And if you're a diplomat, that makes sense. You can't call someone a pygmy. That's wrong, right? But if you're a Bush administration White House official, right? He was perplexed by this question, right? As he thinks about it for a second, he says, "Well, let me think about this. If President Bush were to apologize, he would apologize to the pygmies," which gives you a sense of the relationship. This was the era of Bush, access to evil, outposts of tyranny. I loathe Kim Jong-il, and the relationship went very bad very quickly, right? In fact, it wasn't until almost 2 years into the Bush administration when he finally sent a senior envoy. This is in October 17th of 2002. He sent, October 5th, 2002. He sent James Kelly, then Assistant Secretary of State, to both present North Korea with a bold initiative about how we can improve U.S.-North Korea relations, and also to accuse them of cheating on their agreement. So that basically this is the era where Dick Cheney was saying we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it, right? And they're saying we can't trust North Korea, they're cheating in their deal. And more importantly, how many of you know about A.Q. Khan and his network? So A.Q. Khan is the Pakistani scientist, right, who developed nuclear weapons, particularly through a highly enriched uranium, method of developing centrifuges, which spins this hexafluoride gas very quickly, and eventually you can refine, you can enrich uranium to the point that it can become weapons grade, for a bomb, right? Well, he developed this and then quickly began to sell it to people around the world, like Libya and a bunch of other places around the baddies, right? But he also sold it to North Korea. And we have the return receipts, right? With our cooperation with the Pakistanis and others, right? We know when it was delivered. We know that they got the P2 centrifuges. So the Americans went to North Korea and said, "Look, we've got a problem. How can we move forward diplomacy when we have evidence that you're cheating, that you're working on another nuclear weapon development program?" And then the North Koreans did something in October 2002 which violated the fundamental rule of diplomacy. They told the truth. They came back and they said, "You're right. We did it, and we've got things that are far more fearsome still. Don't mess with us." Which, that makes sense, right? But if you think about the rules of diplomacy, now you're in America, right? How do you say, well, North Korea agreed in '85 not to develop nuclear weapons. They agreed in '92 when they signed the Nuclear Safeguard Agreement not to develop nuclear weapons. They agreed in '94, Geneva Agreed framework not to develop nuclear weapons. They agreed just weeks before with Prime Minister Koizumi, when he was there, actually signed a document that says we will not develop nuclear weapons. And now they say we have developed nuclear weapons, or we're developing nuclear weapons, let's make a new deal. It doesn't work, right? You kind of undermined the credibility necessary for diplomacy. You can't do it. And so that led to a real downward spiral in U.S.-North Korea relations. Things got bad, right? And it's so bad that I was really concerned that in the lead up to the Iraq war that we would have a real conflict with North Korea. North Korea in December of 2002 kicked out IAEA inspectors once again. In December of 2002, North Korea declared that they were no longer a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the only country in history the only country in history to pull out of the NPT, right? In early spring.